Inside Soong Mei-ling, two women fought a lifelong war. One was the saint, the other was the demon. The saint was the beautiful, elegant, English-speaking woman who stood before the U.S. Congress and melted the heart of a superpower. She was the symbol of a brave China, a Christian heroine in silk and pearls who dedicated her life to the ideal of democracy. But the demon was a cold power broker, a ruthless architect of political intrigue. She was the center of a clan that amassed a colossal fortune while the nation starved. A woman who used the language of faith to mask a bottomless greed. She whispered death sentences into the ears of executioners and watched coolly as the children of her rivals were killed. This is not the story of a first lady. It is the chronicle of a century-long civil war, a war between pure patriotism and limitless cruelty. And the final tragedy is that both women needed each other to survive, creating a legacy so complex that no one can ever truly know. Who was the real Soong Mei-ling, a saint who seduced the world, or a demon born from a crumbling empire? To understand the woman who was both, we must first understand the world that created her monsters. Our story begins in the twilight of an empire, the scene, China, at the close of the 19th century. This wasn't the powerful, assertive nation we know today. It was a dying giant, a once proud empire being picked apart by foreign powers. The Qing dynasty, which had ruled for over 250 years under the Manchu emperors, was rotting from the inside out. Humiliated in the Opium Wars by Britain, its great cities carved up into foreign concessions, and then crushingly defeated by a modernized Japan. In 1895, China was a nation on its knees. Its ancient pride had been shattered, its sovereignty was a fiction, and its people were drowning in a haze of opium and despair. It was a world of rigid tradition clashing violently with a forced, unwelcome modernity. A world where ancient Confucian values were proving useless against Western cannons and gunboats. The vast majority of its 400 million people were impoverished peasants, their lives dictated by the seasons and the whims of local landlords. A world away from the political turmoil brewing in Beijing and the coastal cities. Into this vortex of humiliation and confusion, on the 5th of March 1898, a child was born who would come to symbolize this very clash. Her name was Soong Mei-ling. She was born not into the old world of aristocratic mandarins or the struggling peasantry, but into the new world of money, faith, and influence. She was the youngest of 3 daughters, the little princess of the astonishing Soong family, a clan so powerful and influential that they would later be called the Soong Dynasty. To understand Mei-ling's ambition and her unique place in history, one must first understand the almost mythical figure of her father. Her father, Charles Joan Soong, was a character straight out of a novel. His life was a testament to the transformative power of ambition and the collision of East and West. He wasn't born Charles Soong. He was born Han Xiaochun, a poor boy from the southern island of Hainan. Following a well-worn path for the poor, he was sent as a child to live with relatives in Java, in what is now Indonesia, destined for a life of quiet obscurity. But the boy had a fire in him. He yearned for something more. As a teenager, he stowed away on a ship bound for the land of legend, America. He landed in Boston in 1878, a penniless immigrant who spoke no English. His early years were a struggle, working odd jobs in the city's Chinatown. His life changed forever when he encountered a group of Methodist missionaries. They saw a spark in the determined young man, and he, in turn, saw in their faith a path to a new identity. He converted to Christianity and was baptized Charles Jones Soong. The Soong would later be anglicized to Soong. His journey took another incredible turn when he caught the attention of a wealthy North Carolina industrialist named Julian Carr, a devout Methodist. Impressed by Charlie's zeal, Carr became his patron, financing his education at Trinity College, which would later become the world-renowned Duke University. It was an extraordinary sight, a lone Chinese man studying theology in the American South in the aftermath of the Civil War. He absorbed everything, not just the teachings of the Bible, but the language, the customs, and the can-do spirit of American capitalism. He returned to China in 1886, initially as a missionary tasked with spreading the gospel. But Charlie soon realized that a far greater fortune lay in printing the gospel. He founded a company that published Bibles in the Chinese language, a masterstroke that combined his faith with a keen sense of the market. The business was a phenomenal success. From there, he built a commercial empire of printing presses, flour mills, and banks, becoming one of the wealthiest and most influential men in Shanghai. But Charles Soong invested his money in something far more volatile than stocks: revolution. He had seen the future in America and knew that the decaying Qing dynasty was doomed. He became an early and crucial financial backer of a fellow Christian revolutionary, a doctor named Sun Yat-sen, the man who dreamed of toppling the emperor and establishing a modern Chinese republic. The Soong family home, a grand villa in the French concession of Shanghai, became a hive of secret meetings where the future of China was plotted over cups of tea and their printing presses churned out anti-government pamphlets alongside holy scriptures. But if Charlie was the revolutionary gale pushing the family into the storm, it was his wife who served as the steadying hand on the tiller. Mei-ling's mother, Ni Guizhen, was the stoic anchor of this remarkable family. A devout Christian from a prestigious Shanghai merchant family, she was a woman of formidable discipline who ensured her children were raised with a strict blend of Methodist piety and Confucian ethics. While Charlie was the dreamer and the risk-taker, she was the enforcer, the one who instilled in her children a powerful sense of duty and moral purpose. Mei-ling was the baby of the family, the fourth of 6 children, and she grew up in a household crackling with ambition. Each of her siblings was destined for greatness, and their distinct personalities were evident from an early age. The eldest sister, Eiling, born in 1889, was the most like her father, pragmatic, shrewd, and brilliant with money. She was the first Chinese woman to be educated in the United States, a trailblazer in her own right. The family saying about her was simple: she loved money. The second sister, Qing-ling, born in 1893, was the idealist, the quiet beauty who inherited her mother's piety but turned it towards the religion of revolution. She was the true believer. The saying for her was, she loved China. And of Mei-ling, the ambitious youngest, it was said, she loved power. Alongside their brother, T.V. Soong, who was being groomed to take over the family's financial empire, the Soong children weren't just a family. They were a burgeoning political and economic powerhouse. From her earliest days, Mei-ling lived a life of extraordinary privilege, completely insulated from the poverty and chaos outside her garden walls. While most Chinese girls her age were having their feet painfully bound to conform to ancient traditions, a brutal practice that ensured their dependence on men. Mei-ling was learning English from American tutors, playing the piano, and reading Western literature. She was part of a tiny westernized elite, living in the bubble of the Shanghai International Settlement, a world run by foreigners where Chinese law did not apply. This upbringing gave her an incredible advantage. It made her fluent in the language and culture of the West before she ever set foot there. But it also created a fundamental disconnect that would follow her for her entire life. She was Chinese by birth, but her mind, her manners, and her soul were being shaped by America. This internal division would make her both the perfect bridge between two worlds and a permanent outsider in her own land. Charles Soong had a radical vision for his daughters in an age where women were seen as little more than property, destined for arranged marriages and domestic servitude. He believed they could be leaders, and to do that they needed the best education in the world. He sent all three of them to America. It was an unprecedented move for a Chinese family, a huge gamble that would pay off in ways he could never have imagined. In 1908, at the tender age of just 10, it was Mei-ling's turn. Accompanied by her 14-year-old sister Qing-ling, she boarded a steamship, leaving behind the familiar comforts of Shanghai to cross the vast Pacific. Her destination was Macon, Georgia, a sleepy town in the heart of the American South. For a small, sheltered girl who had never known anything but her family's opulent villa, it must have felt like landing on another planet. She was enrolled at the Demarest School, a private institution affiliated with Wesleyan College, where her sisters were already studying. The culture shock was brutal. The food was strange, all fried chicken and sweet potatoes. The customs were baffling, and the language, which she thought she knew, was a different beast entirely when spoken with a thick Georgian drawl. She was the only Chinese student, a tiny figure with dark braided hair and silk jackets in a sea of blonde and brunette American girls in starched white dresses. She was an object of curiosity, an exotic doll to be stared at and whispered about. But it was more than just curiosity. It was here that she encountered the ugly, casual racism of early 20th century America. This was the era of the Chinese Exclusion Act, a federal law that banned Chinese immigration and portrayed the Chinese as a devious, unassimilable yellow peril. She was an outsider, defined not by her sharp mind or her family's wealth, but by the shape of her eyes and the color of her skin. Years later, she confessed the deep pain of this experience in a letter, writing that in America her color of skin made people not see one as a human being. This early wound, the sting of being judged and dismissed, instilled in her a fierce, lifelong determination to be seen, to be respected, and never ever to be looked down upon again. Failure was not an option. Mediocrity was a form of defeat. Instead of retreating into a shell, the young Mei-ling attacked her new environment with a ferocious intelligence. She resolved to master it, to become more American than the Americans. She devoured books, staying up late with a dictionary, determined to expand her vocabulary. She listened intently to her classmates and teachers, mimicking their speech patterns, smoothing out her own accent until it was perfect. The result was her first masterpiece of self-creation. She took the delicate instrument of a Chinese voice and painstakingly retuned it to play the soft, disarming music of a Georgia belle. This accent was not an affectation, it was armor, a sonic camouflage that would allow her to walk undetected through the corridors of Western power. She excelled academically, driven by a relentless need to prove herself. She was not just surviving, she was competing, and she was winning. In 1913, she followed in her sister Eiling's footsteps and enrolled at the prestigious Wellesley College in Massachusetts, one of America's top universities for women. This was the intellectual forge that would complete her transformation. Wellesley was a world away from the genteel South. It was a bastion of East Coast intellectualism, a place buzzing with ideas of female suffrage, social reform, and global politics. The college's motto was non ministri sed ministrare, not to be ministered unto, but to minister, a call to public service and leadership. At Wellesley, surrounded by some of the brightest and most ambitious young women in America, Mei-ling blossomed. She threw herself into her studies, majoring in English literature and minoring in philosophy. She reveled in the intellectual combat of the classroom, becoming a star debater known for her sharp mind, quick wit, and passionate arguments. She graduated in 1917 with high honors, one of only a handful of Chinese women to earn a degree from such an elite American institution. The girl who had arrived from Shanghai was a piece of fine Chinese porcelain. The woman who graduated from Wellesley was a weapon, forged in the fires of American intellectualism, polished with the soft grace of a Southern accent, and aimed squarely at the heart of the world. She was returning to a China she barely knew, a republic in turmoil, and she was returning to a family that was already positioning itself at the very center of power. Her older sisters had made their moves. Ai Ling had married H. Kung, a wealthy banker who would soon become China's finance minister. Qing Ling had married the father of the revolution himself, Sun Yat-sen, against her family's wishes. One sister had married for money, the other for an ideal. Now it was Mei-ling's turn, and she was determined to outshine them both. The Shanghai that Mei-ling returned to in 1917 was the most exciting, decadent, and dangerous city on earth. It was known as the Paris of the East, the whore of the Orient, a city of intoxicating contradictions. Here, unimaginable wealth existed alongside crushing poverty. Western bankers and Chinese gangsters conducted business in the same opulent hotels. Jazz music spilled out of smoky nightclubs while political assassins stalked the alleyways. It was a city living on borrowed time, a dazzling bubble of modernity and vice, largely controlled by foreign powers in their self-governing concessions. And into this glittering, morally ambiguous world stepped Soong Mei-ling. With her impeccable American education, her fluent idiomatic English, and her innate sense of style, she was an instant sensation. She was the living embodiment of the modern China so many yearned for, a bridge between the traditions of the East and the dynamism of the West. She took a position teaching English at her old alma mater, the McTier School, and threw herself into the social and charitable work befitting a woman of her station. She helped organize fundraisers, served on committees for the YWCA, and became a prominent figure in Shanghai's elite social circles. But this was also a period of profound political awakening. A year after her return, her father, Charlie Soong, died, leaving a void in the family and a vast fortune to be managed. More significantly for her, in 1919, she witnessed the explosion of nationalistic fury that became known as the May 4th movement. When news arrived that the Treaty of Versailles would hand German-controlled territories in China over to Japan, students across the country erupted in protest. It was a raw, powerful display of a new Chinese nationalism, a rejection of foreign domination, and a cry for a strong, unified nation. For Mei-ling, watching from the relative safety of Shanghai, the movement solidified her own sense of patriotic purpose. The abstract lessons of history and politics she had studied at Wellesley were now playing out in real time on the streets of her own country. She was beautiful, intelligent, and hailed from the most influential family in the city. Suitors lined up, eager to win the hand of Shanghai's most eligible bachelorette. But Mei-ling was playing a different game. She saw how her older sisters had leveraged their marriages. Ai Ling, the eldest, had married the wealthy banker H. Kung, a man who would soon become the finance minister, giving the family a stranglehold on the nation's economy. Qing Ling, the idealist, had married the revered father of the revolution, Sun Yat-sen, becoming a living saint of the new republic. One had married money, the other a legacy. Mei-ling, still in her early 20s, was ambitious enough to want both. She was not looking for a husband. She was looking for a partner, a man whose ambition matched her own, a man who could give her the one thing she craved above all else, a stage big enough for her talents. Around 1920, at a soiree hosted by her brother, T.V. Soong, she met him. He was everything she was not. He was a soldier, not a scholar. His name was Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang was a rising military star in the Kuomintang, the nationalist party founded by Sun Yat-sen. He was a man forged in hardship and discipline. While Mei-ling was reading Shakespeare at Wellesley, Chiang was studying military strategy in Japan and navigating the treacherous world of Shanghai's secret societies. He was intense, brooding, and possessed a volcanic temper. He didn't speak a word of English, had a deep-seated distrust of foreigners, and came from a modest background as the son of a salt merchant. His personal life was already a tangled mess. He had a first wife back in his home village, a son, Chiang Ching-kuo, who was at that very moment living as a political hostage in Stalin's Soviet Union, and had taken other concubines. On the surface, they were a complete mismatch. She was polished American crystal, he was rough Chinese iron, but Chiang was a man of terrifying single-minded ambition. After Sun Yat-sen's death in 1925, he had skillfully outmaneuvered his rivals to become the leader of the Kuomintang. His goal was to launch a great military campaign, the Northern Expedition, to crush the regional warlords and finally unify China under his command. And in Soong Mei-ling, this ambitious soldier saw the missing pieces of his puzzle. He saw her family's immense wealth, which could finance his armies. He saw their powerful political connections, particularly their sacred link to the legacy of Sun Yat-sen, which would grant him legitimacy. And most importantly, he saw in her fluent English and sophisticated Western manners the perfect bridge to the world outside China. She was the eloquent, respectable voice he needed to gain international recognition, and crucially, the financial and military support of the United States. He began a relentless 5-year courtship. He pursued her with the same single-minded focus he applied to a military campaign. Mei-ling was initially unimpressed, even disdainful. To her, he was an uncultured soldier. Her devoutly Christian mother, Nguyen, was appalled. She saw Chiang as a pagan, a philanderer, and entirely unsuitable for her precious youngest daughter. The family was thrown into a bitter conflict over the potential union. Mei-ling's idealistic sister, Qing-ling, the revered widow of Sun Yat-sen, was his most vocal opponent. She saw Chiang as a brutish military opportunist who was betraying the democratic ideals of her late husband. She believed he was hijacking the revolution for his own personal power. She pleaded with Mei-ling, warning her that marrying Chiang would be a betrayal of their father's legacy and of China itself. But the proposed marriage had two powerful advocates who understood the brutal arithmetic of power: Mei-ling's pragmatic older sister Eiling and her equally ambitious brother Taek-vi Soong. They saw this not as a love match, but as the corporate merger of the century. Their logic was cold and impeccable. Chiang had the army. Their brother-in-law, H. Kung, and TV himself controlled the finances. Mei-ling possessed the charm and the vital connection to the West. Together, this trinity of military, financial, and diplomatic power would be unstoppable. They could, quite literally, own China. They worked relentlessly on Mei-ling and their mother. This wasn't about love, they argued. It was about destiny. It was Mei-ling's patriotic duty to marry this man and guide him, to temper his roughness with her sophistication, and to steer the ship of state. In the end, it was a deal, a negotiation as complex as any treaty. Chiang Kai-shek, desperate to seal the alliance, made a series of extraordinary concessions. He provided legal proof that he had formally divorced his first wife and dismissed his other consorts. He sat down with his formidable future mother-in-law and promised that he would diligently study the Bible and seriously consider converting to her faith. He was, in effect, trading his past for his future, and he offered Mei-ling the one thing she craved above all else, the chance to be at the absolute center of power, to become the first lady of a unified China. For a woman determined to outshine her famous sisters, the offer was irresistible. On December 1st, 1927, they were married in a lavish two-part ceremony in Shanghai. The day began with a quiet, private Christian service at the Soong family home, a concession to her mother. It was followed by a grand, ostentatious public ceremony at the Majestic Hotel, a political affair where Chiang, in his formal military attire, presented his beautiful Western-educated bride to the world. It was the wedding of the decade, a potent symbol of a new China. Time magazine hailed Chiang as the conquering hero, but everyone in Shanghai's inner circles knew who had secured the better deal. As one witty observer noted, the groom had made an excellent son-in-law of the late great Sun Yat-sen, forever linking his military regime to the hallowed legacy of the Republic's founder. It was a political masterpiece, a stunning victory, but even amidst the flash of camera bulbs and the murmur of applause, one face was conspicuously absent: Qing-ling, her sister, the companion of her long-ago voyage to America. In that moment, did she feel the full weight of her choice? To her sister, this was not a wedding. It was a funeral for the revolution. For Mei-ling, it was the coronation she had always craved. The bond forged in their shared American girlhood was now shattered, leaving a bloody ideological chasm in its place, a chasm that would divide their family and China itself for the rest of their lives. She had secured her throne, yes, but at the price of the one person who truly understood the journey it took to get there. It was a bargain she had made with open eyes, but it was also a wound that would shadow all the victories to come. The stage was now set for her grandest performance. In 1928, the year after their marriage, Chiang Kai-shek's armies marched into Beijing, completing the Northern Expedition. He had, at least on paper, defeated the major warlords and unified China under a single government for the first time in decades. He established a new national capital in Nanjing, and at 30 years old, Soong Mei-ling was officially the First Lady of the Republic of China. She had no intention of being a quiet, decorative wife who simply poured tea and hosted parties. That role was far too small for her intellect and ambition. From the very beginning, she positioned herself as her husband's indispensable partner. She was his advisor, his confidant, his personal translator, and his window to the world. Chiang spoke no foreign languages and harbored a deep, almost paranoid distrust of foreigners. All high-level communication with the West, therefore, had to go through her. She sat in on his most important meetings with foreign diplomats and military advisors, a poised and elegant figure who missed nothing. She did more than just translate his words. She interpreted his intentions, skillfully softening his often harsh, dictatorial pronouncements into elegant diplomatic language that Western ears could accept. Foreign ambassadors and journalists quickly learned a fundamental rule of Nanjing politics. To get to the Generalissimo, you had to go through Madame. She wasn't just his wife, she was his de facto Minister of Foreign Affairs, his press secretary, and his chief political strategist rolled into one powerful package. She was the velvet glove on his iron fist. While wielding immense influence behind the scenes, she also stepped into the public spotlight with her own ambitious and deeply controversial project, the New Life movement, launched on February 19, 1934. On the surface, it was a sweeping social campaign to rejuvenate the Chinese spirit. It preached a return to traditional Confucian virtues, propriety, justice, honesty, and self-respect, while also promoting modern habits like hygiene, punctuality, and physical fitness. By 1935, the movement claimed over 5 million members. Mei-ling became its most passionate and visible advocate, traveling the country, giving speeches, and embodying the ideal of the modern Chinese woman she was promoting, virtuous yet strong, traditional yet forward-looking. But many critics, both in China and the West, saw something more sinister in the movement's DNA. With its emphasis on absolute obedience to the leader, its militaristic discipline, and its mass rallies, the New Life movement bore an uncomfortable resemblance to the fascist youth movements then sweeping across Europe. It was an attempt to impose order on a chaotic society, but it was an order that came from the top down, demanding conformity and unquestioning loyalty, not fostering democracy. It starkly revealed the fundamental contradiction of the woman who championed it. An American educated idealist, a graduate of a liberal arts college, who was now the chief promoter of an authoritarian social engineering project. She was using Western methods to enforce a distinctly anti-Western political reality. Her public life was a whirlwind of activity, but her private world was marked by a quiet, persistent sadness. The great political marriage was, by all accounts, a lonely one. It was an open secret among the inner circle that she and Chiang were unable to have children, a source of great personal sorrow for a woman from a family so focused on dynasty and legacy. She filled the void with work, pouring her formidable, restless energy into public service. She led massive flood relief efforts, establishing schools for the orphans of revolutionary soldiers, and became a powerful force in Chinese society in her own right. Her influence was undeniable, her courage often on public display. But it was a bizarre and dramatic crisis in the winter of 1936 that would test her nerve to its absolute limit, and in the process, transform her from a domestic figure into a political player of international consequence. It remains one of the most audacious and pivotal episodes of modern Chinese history. On December 12, 1936, the leader of China, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, was kidnapped. The perpetrator wasn't a communist agent or a Japanese spy. He was one of Chiang's own top commanders, a charismatic, American-educated Manchurian warlord known as the Young Marshal Zhang Shuiliang. Zhang was at his breaking point. His homeland of Manchuria had been seized by the Japanese in 1931, and his troops were burning for revenge. Yet Chiang, his commander-in-chief, remained stubbornly, almost pathologically, focused on his internal enemy, Mao Zedong's communists, who had survived their long march and established a new base in the north. Chiang's inflexible policy was first internal pacification, then external resistance. In a desperate, treasonous act of insubordination, Zhang's troops stormed Chiang's temporary headquarters at a hot spring resort in the city of Xi'an. The Generalissimo, woken by gunfire, was forced to flee in his nightshirt, scrambling up a rocky hill in the dark before being captured. The leader of China was now a hostage, held by his own general with a single explosive demand: stop the civil war and form a united front with the communists to fight Japan. The government in the capital, Nanking, was thrown into utter chaos. The hardliners, led by the Minister of War, were baying for blood. Their plan was simple and brutal: declare Zhang a traitor and launch an all-out aerial bombardment of Xi'an. It was a plan that would almost certainly kill Chiang Kai-shek and plunge China into a new, even more catastrophic civil war, just as the Japanese were massing on their borders. while the capital was paralyzed by fear and political calculation. Soong Mei-ling saw only one path forward: the desperate pleas of the government, even from her own brother, TV Soong, who called it a suicide mission, were just noise. While they saw a trap, she saw the abyss, a nation devouring itself just as the Japanese wolves gathered at the gates. Her resolve was that of a master chess player staring at a board on fire. The letter was her will, a quiet acknowledgement that the game might be lost. But the revolver was her final piece, a cold assurance that if she was to be taken off the board, it would be on her own terms. She was flying into the heart of a mutiny not to save her king, but to save the kingdom itself from his impending checkmate. For her, the greatest fear was not a bullet in Xi'an. It was the crushing disgrace of being remembered as the woman who stood by and watched her world burn. When her plane landed in Xi'an, she emerged, calm and regal, to face the mutineers. She met with the young Marshal Zhang, not with threats or hysterics, but with a shrewd and commanding blend of reason and authority. She appealed to his patriotism, acknowledged the justice of his cause, but warned him of the national chaos that would ensue if Chiang were harmed. Her presence, her sheer nerve, completely changed the dynamic of the crisis. She negotiated not just as a terrified wife, but as a stateswoman. After 13 days of tense, complex talks, which also involved a secret delegation from the communists led by Zhou Enlai, a deal was struck. Chiang Kai-shek was to be released, and he would reluctantly agree to the alliance against Japan. Soong Mei-ling returned to the capital, a national heroine. She had faced down a mutiny with little more than her wits and her courage. She had saved her husband, her government, and perhaps her country from the brink of collapse. She had proven beyond any doubt that she was far more than just the Generalissimo's elegant wife. She was a political force to be reckoned with, a true dragon lady, and her moment in the global spotlight had only just begun. The fragile peace she had brokered was short-lived. Just 6 months later, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China. The Second World War had begun in Asia, and Madame Chiang Kai-shek was about to take her one-woman diplomatic show to the biggest stage on Earth. The truce forged at Xi'an was short-lived. In July 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China. The war that followed was one of unimaginable brutality. The modern mechanized Japanese army swept through China. The first great battle was for Shanghai, Mei-ling's own hometown. For 3 brutal months, Chiang Kai-shek's best German-trained divisions fought with suicidal courage to defend the city, stunning the world and shattering Japan's boast that they could conquer China in a matter of weeks. But the courage of men was no match for the superiority of machines. Shanghai fell, and Chiang's elite forces were decimated in a horrific meat grinder of a battle. The fall of Shanghai opened the floodgates. The Japanese army advanced on the capital, Nanjing. What happened next remains one of the darkest chapters in modern history. In the winter of 1937, after the city fell, Japanese troops unleashed a 6-week orgy of mass murder, rape, and destruction that came to be known as the Nanjing Massacre. An estimated 300,000 Chinese civilians and unarmed soldiers were systematically slaughtered. Women were subjected to unimaginable horrors. The city was burned to the ground. It was an atrocity on a scale that was, at the time, incomprehensible. The national government, including Chiang and Mei-ling, had been forced to flee, first to the central city of Wuhan and then further inland, retreating over 1,000 miles to the remote mountain-ringed city of Chongqing. This would be their wartime capital, a fortress city shrouded in fog, from where they would direct a desperate, long-term war of resistance. Chiang's strategy was brutal and simple. trade space for time. He would sacrifice his cities and his land, drawing the Japanese deeper into the vastness of the Chinese interior, stretching their supply lines and bogging them down in a war of attrition they could not win. It was in this crucible of defeat and defiance that Soong Mei-ling truly came into her own. She was no longer just a glamorous political partner. She was a wartime leader. She threw herself into the war effort with a ferocious, almost superhuman energy. She was everywhere. One day she would be in a makeshift hospital, her elegant silk cheongsams a stark contrast to the blood and grime of the wards, holding the hand of a dying soldier. The next she would be at her desk, writing passionate articles for American magazines, trying to make the world see the horror her people were enduring. She established a network of orphanages, which she called her wharf-hands, for the tens of thousands of children whose parents had been killed in the bombings. She took a personal interest in them, ensuring they were fed, clothed, and educated. To these children she was a savior, a benevolent mother figure in a world that had been torn apart. Her radio broadcasts, delivered in her flawless English, became a vital link to the outside world, a constant, eloquent plea for help. She wasn't afraid to put herself in harm's way. During a tour of the front lines near Shanghai, her convoy was spotted by Japanese aircraft. Her car was strafed with machine gun fire and sent careening into a ditch. She was thrown from the vehicle, suffering several broken ribs and severe internal injuries. For days, she hovered between life and death, but even from her hospital bed, she insisted on working. Her voice, though weakened, still a powerful instrument of national will. She was also fighting a hidden personal war. Her breast cancer, diagnosed just before the invasion, was a constant secret shadow. The physical and emotional strain of the war was immense, yet she pushed on, driven by a combination of patriotic duty and sheer indomitable will. But she knew that courage and willpower alone would not be enough. China was fighting for its very survival, isolated and bleeding. The Western powers, preoccupied with the rise of Hitler in Europe, offered sympathy but little concrete help. Mei-ling knew that if her nation was to survive, she had to change that. She had to make China's war America's cause, and she was the only person who could do it. The world changed on December 7th, 1941. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, while a devastating blow to the United States, was a godsend for China. Suddenly, they were no longer fighting alone. They were a crucial ally in a global war against the Axis powers. The door to Washington, D.C. was now wide open, and Madame Chiang Kai-shek was about to walk through it. In late 1942, under the official pretext of seeking further medical treatment for a recurring and painful skin condition, she embarked on the most important mission of her life. She was going to America to launch a charm offensive of epic proportions, to conquer the hearts and minds of the one nation that could save her own. America had never seen anyone like her. From the moment she arrived, she was a sensation. She was not some timid, exotic visitor. She was a stateswoman, a celebrity, and a political force of nature, all wrapped in one impossibly elegant package. She traveled first to New York for medical treatment, but her hospital suite quickly became a political salon, where she received a stream of the most powerful people in America. Then she was invited to the White House, where she stayed for 11 days as the personal guest of President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his wife, Eleanor. The First Ladies made for a fascinating contrast. Eleanor, the plain-speaking liberal conscience of America, was initially in awe of Madame Chiang's intellect, charm, and courage, but she was also privately taken aback by her aristocratic bearing. She noted in her diary how Madame Chiang had brought her own silk sheets and demanded constant attention from a retinue of nurses and servants. She could clap her hands to summon anyone, a gesture that reminded Eleanor more of an imperial court than a democratic household. She admired the mind, but was wary of the empress. President Roosevelt, however, was completely captivated. He spent hours with her, listening as she brilliantly articulated the complexities of the war in Asia, making a powerful case for increased aid. She wasn't just pleading, she was strategizing, speaking to him as an equal. But her private meetings in the White House were just the warm-up act. The main event, the performance that would cement her legend, took place on February 18, 1943. Madame Chiang Kai-shek stood before a packed joint session of the United States Congress. She was the second woman but the first Chinese person ever to be granted that honor. The chamber was electric with anticipation. Dressed in a stunning, form-fitting black cheongsam slit, high on the sides, her hair perfectly coiffed, she looked both fragile and powerful, an icon of Eastern grace and Western sophistication. And then she began to speak. In her flawless Southern accented English, she spoke for over 20 minutes, almost entirely without notes. This was no dry political speech. It was a tour de force of rhetoric, emotion, and political theater. She did not beg for charity. She spoke as a proud and equal ally. She described the 5.5 years of brutal, lonely resistance her people had endured, reminding America that China had been soaking up the full fury of the Japanese military long before Pearl Harbor. I can say with conviction that the Chinese people have been and are confident in the fact that you will not fail them in their hour of need. We of China are convinced that it is the better part of wisdom not to accept failure ignominiously, but to risk it gloriously. She challenged them, gently but firmly rebuking the Allies' Europe First strategy. She warned them that if they allowed their ally in the Pacific to fall, they would ultimately have to fight a much longer and bloodier war on two fronts. She ended not with a plea, but with a powerful call to action, declaring that if America gave China the tools, they would finish the job. The effect was electrifying. When she finished, the chamber erupted. Congressmen, senators, reporters, and guests leapt to their feet, cheering, whistling, some with tears streaming down their faces. The applause was thunderous, going on for a full 4 minutes. It was an act of political alchemy, a performance so masterful that she transformed 5 years of her country's brutal, messy, and often corrupt suffering into a single beautiful and heroic myth that America could understand and, more importantly, could fall in love with. Her speech was a public relations masterpiece. It cemented China's place as one of the big four allied powers and was directly influential in securing over $1.5 billion in aid through the Lend-Lease Act. Time magazine put her on the cover, naming her and her husband Man and Wife of the Year. She was, for a moment, the undisputed queen of the world stage. Her tour didn't end in Washington. She embarked on a cross-country trip, speaking to sold-out crowds in Madison Square Garden in Chicago, and in a climactic address to 30,000 people at the Hollywood Bowl in Los Angeles. She was treated like a visiting monarch, a movie star, and a saint all rolled into one. She had done it. She had single-handedly won over the hearts and minds of the American establishment and public. It was her finest hour, a moment of supreme, unassailable triumph. But power politics is a world of shadows and secrets, and even at this dazzling height, whispers of controversy followed her. During a 1942 visit to the wartime capital of Chongqing by the prominent American politician Wendell Willkie, a persistent and scandalous rumor had emerged. Willkie, a charismatic figure who had run against Roosevelt for president, was utterly captivated by Madame Chiang. During a formal banquet, both he and Mei-ling seemed to vanish together for a period, causing a frantic search by Chiang's notoriously jealous bodyguards. The incident was quickly hushed up, but the rumor of a possible affair, or perhaps a calculated flirtation, a honey trap to secure American support, lingered for years in diplomatic circles. Whether true or not, it was a glimpse into the high-stakes, morally ambiguous world of power politics she inhabited. She had learned to use every weapon at her disposal, and her charm was by far the most devastating of all. Soong Mei-ling returned from America at the peak of her influence, the celebrated savior of her nation. But the heroic democratic China she had so brilliantly sold to the American public was a carefully constructed fiction. The reality on the ground was far darker, a truth that a handful of skeptical Americans were beginning to see with their own eyes. Chiang Kai-shek's government was not a thriving democracy. It was a corrupt, one-party dictatorship, propped up by a brutal secret police and suffocated by a level of graft that was breathtaking in its scale. And at the heart of that corruption, many whispered, was her own family, the Soong dynasty. Her brother TV Soong and brother-in-law H. Kong held immense power over the nation's finances and were widely accused of enriching themselves while the country starved. Billions of dollars in American aid, meant for soldiers' salaries and relief for civilians, seemed to vanish into the pockets of corrupt officials. The most damning and vocal critic of this reality was a gruff, straight-talking American general named Joseph Stilwell. Sent to China to serve as Chiang Kai-shek's chief of staff, Vinegar Joe Stilwell had no time for the glamour and flattery of Chongqing's high society. He saw the rot up close, and he wasn't afraid to speak his mind. He despised Chiang, whom he privately nicknamed the Peanut, for his military incompetence and his infuriating habit of hoarding his best troops to blockade the communists rather than fight the Japanese. And he had a special visceral disdain for Madame Chiang. He saw through the performance. To him, she was the elegant English-speaking puppet master, the charming front for a hopelessly corrupt system. In his brutally honest diaries, he referred to her as the Empress or Dragon Lady, accusing her of using her charm to manipulate the Americans while protecting her corrupt family. While she was charming Congress, Stilwell was sending scathing reports back to Washington, describing a regime that was gasping for breath, decrepit, rotten. He and Madame Chiang clashed spectacularly, their mutual hatred becoming the stuff of legend. She saw him as a crude, disrespectful foreigner who insulted her husband and her country. He saw her as a manipulative actress, the queen of a rotten kingdom. The feud reached its climax when Stilwell, frustrated beyond measure, convinced President Roosevelt to demand that Chiang hand over full command of the Chinese army to him. For Chiang, this was the ultimate insult to his sovereignty. For Mei-ling, it was a declaration of war. She marshaled all her powerful friends in Washington, lobbied furiously, and ultimately succeeded in having Stilwell recalled in 1944. In her personal war against Stilwell, she had proven her power in Washington was absolute. She had successfully protected her husband's throne, but she had done so by setting fire to the very bridge of trust she had so painstakingly built to America. It was a tactical masterpiece that guaranteed a strategic catastrophe. The image of the heroic alliance was irrevocably tarnished. Despite the internal rot, China was on the winning side of the war. In 1943, Mei-ling accompanied her husband to the Cairo Conference, where they sat as equals alongside Roosevelt and Winston Churchill to decide the fate of post-war Asia. With Mei-ling acting as his indispensable translator and advisor, Chiang secured a major victory. The Allies promised that all Chinese territories seized by Japan, including Taiwan, would be returned to China. In August 1945, the atomic bombs fell and Japan surrendered. 8 long, brutal years of war were finally over. China was, on paper, a great and victorious power. It was granted a permanent seat on the new United Nations Security Council. Chiang Kai-shek and his wife were hailed as the saviors of their nation. It should have been their moment of ultimate triumph, but the victory was a mirage. The war had left China bankrupt, exhausted, and more divided than ever. And the moment the Japanese surrendered, the old festering wound of the Civil War burst wide open. While Chiang's armies had been decimated fighting the Japanese, Mao Zedong's communist forces, operating in the countryside, had grown stronger than ever. The final bloody chapter of the struggle for China was about to begin. Madame Chiang had won the battle for America's heart, but she was about to lose the battle for the soul of her own country. The Chinese Civil War, which erupted with renewed ferocity in 1946, was a contest that, on paper, Chiang Kai-shek should have won easily. His nationalist army was 4 times larger than Mao's forces and lavishly equipped with modern American weapons, tanks, artillery, and aircraft. He controlled all of China's major cities, its industries, and its infrastructure. Mao Zedong, by contrast, was a guerrilla leader whose peasant army was armed with a motley collection of captured rifles. He controlled no major cities, only the impoverished countryside. To most outside observers, the outcome seemed a foregone conclusion. The American military predicted a swift and decisive victory for Chiang. But Chiang Kai-shek and his American backers failed to understand a fundamental truth of this war. It would not be won with tanks and planes. It would be won in the hearts and minds of the Chinese people. And in that crucial battlefield, Chiang's regime was already catastrophically defeated. The same disease that had plagued his government during the war against Japan had now metastasized, consuming the nation from within. That disease was corruption. When the nationalist officials returned to the cities that had been occupied by the Japanese, they were not greeted as liberators. They behaved like a new army of occupation. They seized property, extorted businesses, and treated the local population with contempt, viewing anyone who had survived under the Japanese as a potential traitor or collaborator. The 8 years of war had not purified the Kuomintang. It had made it more rapacious, more desperate. The economy, already shattered by war, completely collapsed under the weight of the government's incompetence and greed. To fund his massive army, Chiang printed money with reckless abandon. The result was hyperinflation on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend. Prices doubled, then quadrupled, then rose by the hour. People's life savings, painstakingly accumulated over generations, were wiped out in a matter of weeks. A salary paid in the morning was worthless by evening. To buy a single bag of rice, people had to carry suitcases, even wheelbarrows, full of useless banknotes. The urban middle class, the doctors, teachers, and small business owners, who should have been the bedrock of a modern republic, was utterly destroyed. Their loyalty to the government evaporated along with their savings. Meanwhile, a tiny elite at the top grew obscenely wealthy. At the center of this whirlwind of graft were, once again, members of Soong Mei-ling's own family. Her brother T.V. Soong and brother-in-law H.H. Kung were widely accused of using their control over the nation's finances to speculate on currency and funnel vast fortunes into their own overseas bank accounts. The perception was that while the nation starved, the Soong dynasty was getting rich. In stark contrast, Mao Zedong and the communists offered a simple, powerful, and intoxicating promise to the hundreds of millions of peasants who made up the vast majority of China's population: land. In the areas they controlled, they systematically dismantled the ancient feudal system. They seized the vast estates of landlords, often violently, and distributed the land to the tenant farmers who had worked it for generations. To a peasant who had never owned anything, whose family had been virtual serfs for centuries, this was not a political ideology, it was salvation. Mao wasn't just a distant leader, he was the man who had given them their own piece of earth. The peasants, in turn, gave Mao their undying loyalty. Their sons flocked to join his People's Liberation Army. They acted as his eyes and ears, providing intelligence on nationalist troop movements. They carried supplies for his soldiers on their backs over mountain paths. Chiang Kai-shek's power was transactional. It was bought with American silver and maintained by fear. Mao Zedong's power was theological. It was earned with the promise of land and sealed by the faith of a desperate people. In the final battle for China, a faith will always defeat a payroll. The military collapse of the nationalists was as swift as it was total. Chiang, a conventionally trained soldier, tried to fight a conventional war, relying on his superior firepower and holding onto major cities. Mao, the master of guerrilla warfare, refused to play by his rules. He lured Chiang's overextended armies deep into the countryside, cut their supply lines, and then annihilated them in massive battles of encirclement. The nationalist soldiers, unpaid, unfed, and led by corrupt and incompetent officers, had no will to fight. Entire divisions, complete with their brand new American equipment, would surrender to the communists without firing a single shot. The communists had a grim joke. Their main supplier of weapons wasn't America, but Chiang Kai-shek, their chief of supply. Soong Mei-ling watched the disintegration of her husband's empire with a growing sense of horror and disbelief. In a last desperate gamble, she flew to Washington in late 1948 to plead for a massive emergency aid package. But the magic was gone. The American political establishment, now led by President Harry Truman, had grown weary of the endless corruption and military failures of the Kuomintang. They saw Chiang's regime as a lost cause, a rat hole into which they would pour no more good money after bad. The reception she received was icy. The woman who had been greeted as a global hero just 5 years earlier was now seen as the desperate representative of a failing, corrupt dynasty. The press was hostile, the politicians were evasive. Her mission was a humiliating failure. She had lost her audience. By late 1949, the war was over. The communists controlled the entire mainland. Chiang Kai-shek, his government, and the shattered remnants of his army, some 2 million soldiers, officials, and their families, prepared for a final desperate retreat. In a last act on the mainland, Chiang ordered that China's greatest treasures be crated up and shipped away. Hundreds of thousands of priceless artifacts from the Forbidden City, and just as importantly, the entire gold reserve of the national treasury. He was not just abandoning his country, he was taking its history and its wealth with him. They boarded ships and planes for a small mountainous island that had recently been returned to China after 50 years of Japanese rule. An island just 100 miles off the coast of the continent he had lost. An island called Taiwan. On October 1st, 1949, as Mao Zedong stood before 1 million cheering people in Tiananmen Square and declared the founding of the People's Republic of China, his old rival was in the midst of a humiliating flight. The great struggle for China was over. The Soong dynasty had fallen. For Mei-ling, the defeat was also a profound personal tragedy. Her beloved sister Qing-ling, the idealist, had stayed behind. She had thrown her lot in with Mao and the communists, believing they represented the true spirit of her late husband, Sun Yat-sen's revolution. On that historic day in Tiananmen Square, Qing-ling stood on the rostrum, an honored guest beside Chairman Mao. The political rift between the sisters was now a chasm, an unbridgeable ocean that would separate them for the rest of their lives. Soong Mei-ling, the once celebrated First Lady of 450 million people, was now the First Lady of a small, defeated, and terrified island. She was an empress in exile. Life in Taiwan was a strange twilight existence. In the eyes of the world, they were a government in exile, the rump state of a defeated regime, clinging precariously to a rock in the sea. But on the island, Chiang Kai-shek ruled as an absolute dictator. Haunted by the memory of his defeat, he was determined not to repeat his mistakes. He concluded that he had lost the mainland not because of corruption, but because he had not been ruthless enough. In Taiwan, he would not make that mistake again. He imposed a state of martial law that would last for 38 years, from 1949 to 1987, one of the longest in modern history. This period became known as the White Terror. His secret police hunted down and eliminated anyone suspected of being a communist sympathizer or a dissident. Thousands were executed. Tens of thousands were imprisoned. The island became a fortress, a police state dedicated to the single, obsessive dream of one day retaking the mainland. Soong Mei-ling dutifully played her role as the First Lady of this island redoubt. She continued to be the elegant, Christian, Americanized face of her husband's brutal, anti-communist regime. She made frequent trips to the U.S., where she was a leading figure in the powerful China lobby, relentlessly campaigning against any recognition of Mao's Red China. For years, she was successful, ensuring that Taiwan, not the mainland, held China's seat at the United Nations and continued to receive American military and economic aid. She also led charitable organizations, founded schools, and promoted the arts. To the outside world, she was still the great Madame Chiang, a symbol of free China. But her real power, her influence on the course of events, was steadily waning. A new power was rising in Taiwan, one who had little time for the glamour and influence of the Soong family, her stepson, Chiang Ching-kuo. Their relationship had always been frosty. Ching-kuo, who had spent years as a virtual hostage in the Soviet Union under Stalin, was a very different man from his father. He was a pragmatist and a populist, and he saw his stepmother and her powerful Soong relatives as symbols of the very corruption and elitism that had lost them the mainland. As his father aged and his health failed, Ching-kuo, who controlled the secret police and the military, consolidated his own power base. He gradually pushed Mei-ling and her faction to the political margins. The empress was slowly being isolated in her own court. The final decisive blow came in 1975. After ruling for nearly half a century, first on the mainland and then on Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek died. Soong Mei-ling, now 77 years old, was a widow. Her emotional anchor and the ultimate source of her political power was gone. She presided over his grand funeral, a stoic, dignified figure in black, but it was clear to everyone that her time at the center of the world was over. Power passed seamlessly to her stepson, Chiang Ching-kuo. There was no room in the new order for the Dowager Empress. Isolated and politically irrelevant, she made a momentous decision. In 1975, at the age of 77, Soong Mei-ling left Taiwan. She returned to America not for a triumphant speaking tour, but for a quiet, self-imposed exile. She settled on her family's sprawling 36-acre estate in Long Island, New York, surrounded by servants and the ghosts of her past. The woman who once advised presidents and commanded the world's attention now lived a life of quiet, almost monastic seclusion. The roar of the crowds had long faded, replaced by the quiet rustle of leaves in her Long Island garden. Her days fell into a silent rhythm, marked not by state dinners, but by chapters of the Bible. Her true solace, however, was found in a world of ink and paper. She became an accomplished painter, her brush summoning traditional Chinese landscapes. Misty mountains she could no longer climb, winding rivers she could no longer cross. With every stroke of her brush, she was not painting a landscape. She was conducting a seance, desperately trying to summon the ghost of a China that existed now only in her memory. In the main hall, the ghost of that past stared back. A large formal portrait of her husband, the Generalissimo, hung in its place of honor, a silent king in a silent court. She never renounced her title. For in this quiet world of her own making, she was still the First Lady, but outside her gates the real world had moved on, leaving the last empress to reign over an empire of memories. She became a silent witness to a history that was happening without her. From her gilded cage in Long Island, she watched as the world she knew, the world she had fought for and against, was completely transformed. She saw President Nixon travel to Beijing in 1972, shaking hands with her old nemesis Mao Zedong. She saw the United States, her cherished ally, formally sever diplomatic ties with Taiwan in 1979 and recognize the communist government in Beijing. She saw Taiwan, the island her husband had ruled with an iron fist, blossom into one of Asia's most vibrant and noisy democracies after her stepson's death in 1988. And she saw mainland China, the country she had fled in defeat, begin its own astonishing economic transformation under Deng Xiaoping, embracing a form of capitalism more dynamic than anything she could have imagined. She outlived them all, her sisters, her brother, her husband, her stepson, and all her political rivals. She lived through the end of the Qing Dynasty, the birth of the Republic, 2 world wars, a civil war, and the dawn of the 21st century. Her long and impossibly eventful life finally came to an end on October 23, 2003, in her Manhattan apartment. She was 105 years old. Her funeral was held at a church in Manhattan, a quiet affair, attended by 1,000 mourners. In her will, she requested not to be buried in Taiwan, holding on to the faint, impossible hope that one day she and her husband could be laid to rest together on the Chinese mainland, in a country that had long since rendered them footnotes in its official history. So how should that history remember this extraordinary woman? Was she a devoted patriot who used her unique gifts to fight for her country? Or was she the elegant, acceptable face of a brutal and corrupt regime, a master of propaganda who sold a lie to the world? The truth is, she was both. She was a woman of incredible talent, courage, and determination who operated in a world of impossible choices. She believed in the promise of a modern, Christian, democratic China. Yet she tied her fate to an authoritarian strongman and became an accomplice to his regime. She used her American education to plead for freedom while defending a government that crushed it. Her life is a powerful and perhaps tragic story about the natures of power and the compromises one makes to hold on to it. She was the ultimate paradox, the saint who sold a beautiful, democratic dream to the West, and the demon who helped enforce a corrupt, authoritarian nightmare in the East. She was the magnificent bridge between 2 worlds, but her tragedy was that, in the end, the bridge itself was her only true home.